Hello, I'm David Zetland, and I'm going to be talking with Paul today about water stuff. I'm going to let him do the formal introductions. Welcome to this podcast.
Thanks, David. So my name is Paul Verval. I'm the managing editor of the Global Water Forum. I'm going to be talking here today with David Zetland, a water economist and professor at Leiden University College. David works extensively on different issues related to water security and has recently published a book called Living with Water Scarcity. Today, the focus of our discussion is going to be with regards to drought in the United States and some of the governance issues surrounding that. So thanks very much, David, for having a chat with me. And as the first question, so the current drought conditions in California appear to be getting worse. Last week it was declared about 80% of the state was affected by severe drought conditions. The situation is very bad in other US states like Kansas. Could you talk a little bit to how water use and water governance needs to change in US states in response to this drought?
Right. So the first thing I want to step back and say is that drought is a natural occurrence. It basically means that you're getting less water than you expect in terms of normal precipitation and hydrological cycles. So drought happens everywhere on the planet. It becomes a serious problem when the people who are used to using a certain amount of water are not able to use less because there's not so much around. And then they need to figure out a way of doing the same or getting by with less. Or living with water scarcity is the cliche of the book. But the point that I'm making here is that whatever I say about California or the United States could easily apply in other countries because lots of countries experience water cycles in different ways. So what's the governance question and how can it be fixed in the United States is a really interesting place to start with this. The first thing is that the problems of the drought, the damages of the drought, the headlines and of food prices going up and farm workers losing their jobs have a lot to do with governance, and sometimes more to do with governance than they do with the drought itself. The easy way to think about that is that if there was not so much activity dependent on water, and you had 100 units of water arriving every year, but you were only using 20 units of water, that if only 50 units of water arrive, and so you are losing half of your supply, but you're only using 20 units of water, still, then you're actually not feeling that drought too much. You're not experiencing that drought. And the governance question is on the one hand, how much of the water should we use of what's available? And the other hand is what should we do about it when there's not enough water around anymore? And in the United States and in California, there are many governance structures that are not very well designed to deal with drought. From the first standpoint, you could talk about the country being divided into 50 states. The state boundaries do not necessarily reflect river boundaries or hydrological boundaries. When you get within the states, you've got counties, which are a sub-state governance unit. The counties don't necessarily reflect hydrological facts, although that was suggested a long time ago. So you have political boundaries that don't line up with physical boundaries. And what that means is that you might get two different political groups fighting over water, that they may have a river between their two areas, and they're fighting over water saying, no, it's mine, no, it's mine. So that's the first issue in terms of governance that could be done better in a lot of states, and it depends on the particular river or basin. The other issue is that a lot of parts of the United States, so the governance of water is very local. So there's, for example, over 50,000 water utilities in the United States. There's according to the California Department of Water Resources, an unknown number of water management organizations in California. They don't actually know how many there are, but several thousand water management organizations are out there. So from a governance perspective, the good news is that all those different organizations can respond in their own way. The bad news is that they may be totally uncoordinated in their responses, including overlapping and canceling each other out. So they have a basic problem in California, for example, of not even knowing who's out there managing water. They don't know how much groundwater, for example, is being pumped, or how much surface water is being taken by certain users who have old permissions to use water. Those measurement issues make governance much harder because people don't even know who's using water where. I can go on, but I'll start with that, Paul.
Okay, and so it's an interesting point that you raise in terms of political boundaries, states, counties. Within the existing system, what sort of changes do you think could be made? Some sort of overarching arrangements at the state level in order to get counties to and water utilities to work better together?
Yeah, that tends to drag people into a big constitutional discussion. The first thing is I wouldn't ban the states, so let's stick with the basic form of the union. But I would, I think we can borrow an idea from Australia, which is for better or for worse, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. I think, is that the current name of it?
It's the authority at the moment.
Authority. So the authority has been given a authority, literally, with a small a, over the Murray and the Darling rivers and the basin that they run in. And that is important in Australia because those rivers are the sole source of water, or the major source of water, to a lot of areas. And those same conditions exist in the southwest United States. The Colorado River Basin is very famous for being the only river basin in a lot of very dry areas. You've got the Rio Grande, which is shared between Texas and Mexico. So if there were a move to put a super authority in charge of the river that would supersede the state's authorities, and that would replace, for example, the Colorado River Compact in the United States, then you might have the ability, for example, to negotiate more easily water sharing agreements between upriver and low river users without getting into state politics, which happens today. So those negotiations are cut off by state politics, where an Arizona farmer is not negotiating with a Colorado city. The Arizona farmer is either stopped by other Arizona water users or the Arizona legislature, which says they're in charge of negotiating with Colorado. The Colorado legislature says, we're not in session right now. There's a whole bunch of problems with that, basically. So the United States reform, it could go towards managing river basins, which is the way the EU has gone with its Water Framework Directive, as an easy first step that creates lots of complications because of trying to undo hundreds of years of management institutions, or undo or change. But it's definitely the right way to go. That's a long answer, but it's kind of where I would go with governance.
Okay, that's great. And so talking about sort of broader issues of governance, in terms of water use at the local level, say for farms in particular, what are the sorts of changes that you think need to occur in, say, farming practices in these drought-stricken regions?
I think there's two major changes that I would say. The first one is the farming practices are not necessarily an issue. The way farmers use water, the crops they choose, their land, labor allocations are the result of farmers doing the best they can given their situation. So what we need to do is put those agricultural practices in a better context, a more sustainable context. The two areas that are the most important for that are groundwater and surface water. In the case of groundwater, there is a common problem around the world. It is the worst in California, but it is also a big problem in other U.S. states, of not knowing how much groundwater there is or how much groundwater is being used. Literally not tracking it at all. There's no meters, there's no measurement, and so that is the farmers are doing what they're doing. And I don't necessarily care about the impact on me, but if no one is measuring what's going on, then we don't know how one farmer affects another, if a farming community can stay in business for more than 10 years, or they wipe out their water, The quality of their groundwater might matter. So there's a lot of groundwater monitoring and measurement that is very useful for everyday water consumption, but especially in drought, because then you know how much water you can borrow from the future from the ground. The other dimension of water management that farmers should be involved in, not necessarily, again, changing their practices of farming, but changing the way they source their water, is having a more fluid system of trading water rights with each other. Water rights are long-standing and complicated in the United States. They vary according to many different definitions. Those rights, it would be useful to simplify some of the rights, I'm sure, but in the main part, I would say it's a good idea to make it easier to trade water, one group within one group, for example, so that some farmers might not actually use their land at all this year, but their neighbors would use their land by buying water from the other farmers, their neighbors. So surface water reallocation is very important, even within local farming communities. So I would suggest that as a big step forward.
And I guess one of the consequences of greater trading of water is that then you will have a price which is broader throughout the market. Do you think that prices need to be higher in terms of water that's being traded now, and that the very high prices of some California water trades, do you think that at the moment, do you think that they're beneficial in terms of addressing the drought issue?
Wow, it's a good question. Usually you would say the price reflects the balance of supply and demand, but these prices that have been coming up in auctions in California are roughly $1,000 to $2,000 per acre foot. Now that doesn't mean very much to almost anybody on the planet, but an acre foot is a amount of water. It's 326,000 gallons. It's 1,234 cubic meters. The key idea is that it's a lot of water. It's a farming unit in terms of how much you need to run a farm, and those prices of $1,000 to $2,000 an acre foot are roughly 10 times to 50 times higher than what farmers pay. So that is what matters. The price is extraordinarily high. Does that price reflect the balance of supply and demand? It does in a very limited way, in the sense that there was an auction of limited number of buyers and sellers. In fact, one seller in each of those auctions. But some of those prices are quite high because of uncertainty. The farmers don't know if they're going to get water from their normal delivery areas. They don't know if it's going to rain. They have put in crops, and they have contracts for those crops, and they have to deliver. So they're very desperate to buy water. So there's a lot of factors that are going into that price. And it's an auction, which is a one-shot auction for maybe only this year. If there were continuous buying and selling, if there were numerous trades among many different farmers, let's say, across the state, then we would have a much better idea of price. Then price would be helpful in terms of farmers planning whether or not they want to use water or not use water, or they want to use a different crop or whatever. But at the moment in California, the prices are arriving, and those auctions, is just 2 auctions in the last 3 months. So there's not like everyday pricing that we would be that would benefit decision making. What you have are these kinds of shocking prices showing up that are scaring, I'm sure, actually a lot of farmers and people in agricultural communities, because they're thinking, we can't make any money with this much water. We're not going to do anything this year. So I think that's what's going on right now. The prices are more, they're reallocating the water, but they're quite scary for farmers. And they're better than having no prices at all, which is that we've got no water and no prices. So it's just not a good situation from the agricultural side.
Speaking about California in particular, it's the US's largest agricultural producer in terms of the value of production. A lot of really high value agricultural products such as tomato, lettuce, other vegetables and nuts. And the prices of these are really increasing because of their scarcity and because of the drought. Now, do you think it would be in the national interest, national US interest, for policymakers to start to provide incentives to shift production of some of these high-value products to other states in order to protect consumers and, in a sense, provide a bit of a hedge against drought risk?
I wouldn't. Every time the U.S. government sticks its policy into agricultural production, it gets worse in terms of the mix of crops, the volumes of crops. Um, the U.S. corn producing industry is driven primarily by policies that reward growing corn and require corn ethanol for fuels and so on. So I wouldn't have the federal government doing anything to tell farmers what to grow or who to sell it to in terms of imports, exports. Uh, there is an interesting question that Americans have not, they're not used to being number two on anything. So a bunch of foreigners coming along and outbidding Americans for almonds might upset some people. Or, you know, having to pay more for fuel than people pay in another country, or having to pay more for meat than people pay in another country. So in some cases, Americans have gotten used to being number one and taken for granted cheap food and cheap fuel and cheap water. I think it's appropriate to ask, you know, or to remember that that can't continue or shouldn't continue forever, especially not when there's not a lot of fuel around or a lot of water. We have to let markets reallocate. All those things said, I will put the important caveat that the price of food and the price of water that goes into that food should be reasonable in terms of sustainability, in terms of we can use this much water, no more, that's why it costs so much. Now you make it as a cropping decision, and now your tomatoes are going to cost, you know, in the U.S., tomatoes that cost in summer $3 and $4 a pound in summer would drive people crazy. Those are like winter prices. And over here in the Netherlands, I'm getting €2 a kilo, right? Because the Dutch are quite good at growing tomatoes in hothouses, and they've got abundant water. If they can do $2 a kilo over here, and the U.S. they're looking at, or even $1 a kilo, and the U.S. they're looking at $5 a kilo, that might seem to be a violation of Americans' right to consume cheap tomatoes. But it also might reflect the fact that there's not a lot of water around to grow those tomatoes, and that's useful. I don't think it's going to lead to starvation. You know, for people that are paying $18 for a main course with a side salad for free, they are not going to be in trouble. But the price signals should go out there, and the crop mix will change based on everything, many things.
Okay. And you mentioned federal intervention earlier on. So the most recent U.S. Farm Bill expanded crop insurance. So what impact do you think this expansion will have on farmers' decisions around water use during drought and non-drought periods?
Yeah, so in the insurance business, a long time ago, they came up with this expression of moral hazard, which sounds like a terrible jargon. Moral hazard more or less means that if I'm the insurance company and you're the insured, you're buying insurance from me, and if I insure you against making mistakes, that you might make more mistakes because you're like, hey, I make a mistake, David's going to pay for it. So when the federal government, or any government for that matter, insures a crop against failure, and the crop then proceeds to fail, then the farmer is not losing as much money as if he had no insurance. So what you want to do with drought insurance or farm insurance or any of those things is say, we will insure you for a catastrophe and things that go wrong that are not your fault, but we won't insure you for things that are your fault. One thing that you shouldn't be doing in terms of a drought is planting a crop that cannot handle a drought. And so the insurance in some ways should cover, you know, maybe certain crops or certain yields of crops or whatever, and that people who are missing those guidelines would not get paid. That's the important thing. At the moment in the U.S., for a lot of farmers, especially the big industrial farmers, if you make a mistake, you get paid by the government. If you don't make a mistake, you make profits in the market. So it's kind of a no-lose situation. It's a sucker's game for the taxpayer, unfortunately. So the Farm Bill wouldn't have been helping that dynamic if it's providing more insurance for bad behavior. To be honest, though, I have not read the Farm Bill. I have stayed away from the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a nightmare of legalese. So it could say all kinds of beautiful things that I don't know about because I haven't read it, but I doubt it.